So what sort of atheism do Freud and Nietzsche articulate? When they say God is dead, as Nietzsche does, what's really behind that phrase? And what Freud does, what Ricœur does is ask three questions. One, what God is dead? Two, who has killed him? And three, what authority belongs to the announcement of the death? We'll just go through these one by one. So, what God is dead? The God of ontotheology. And that's one of those nifty big words. Onto is just being. Theology is the study of God, theos. So, the God of ontotheology is the God that can be proven, quote unquote, by using existence or by equating God with being. Right? If you think of theology as a game of shift, like that game where you put like a little marble under the cup and then you mix all the cups around, something like that. It's one that all of a sudden you're talking about God and then the proof relies on being, or the concept of being, instead of the traditional like Judaic God, the Hebrew God, or the Christian God. It just becomes into being, and that's the kind of God that dies. Number two, the process exposes how the God of duty, which is based in any sense of ethical obligation, is grounded on a basic accusation, right? So when you take out ontotheology and this notion of being, that uncouples the notion of being equals this kind of good, or this kind of moral duty, or this kind of imperative, and once that's uncoupled, then all that's left is the sense of accusation. Okay, and what Freud and Nietzsche do is show how the fear and desire transforms the resentment of the weak into a sense of volitional autonomy that can choose good over evil. So because of that, this is going back mostly to the genealogy of morals, but it's that notion of a slave morality that looks at will or volition is that which can opt for good instead of evil, or what it calls evil, and makes that choice of opting, or that notion of volition in the will, itself the kind of the linchpin of determining whether or not you're a good person. Okay? And that's the way they try to escape from accusation. Make sense? Question two, who is the murderer? There is no agent or figure that kills God, quote unquote. It's the working out of the absolute nothingness at the heart of God. It's baselessness. Okay? So for those who are grounded in the secular world, one way you can think about it, this isn't Ricœur, but it's the working through of suspicions about government that suddenly allow you to realize, wait, nobody's actually authorizing the government to make the laws that it's making. Nobody can authorize any one police officer to enforce laws in one kind of way as opposed to another. And once you see that whole framework of authority in political life or political thought is totally baseless, then suddenly a huge nothingness strikes through and it really destabilizes the force of law in any given country, right? That's the kind of nothingness at the heart of God that Nietzsche sees, or Ricœur claims that Nietzsche sees working out through the death of God. Does that make sense? Okay. Question three, what authority belongs to the announcement of God's death? And here's Ricœur's take on it. First, Nietzsche is a rebel. He's not a prophet. He's not the Superman. He's not the Übermensch that he talks about. I mean, that's Zarathustra. It's not him. He says, quote, Nietzsche's major work remains an accusation of accusation, and hence falls short of a pure affirmation of life. Right? He's critical of the corrupt parts of religion, but he doesn't affirm anything. He's just really, really good at showing what's wrong with what's there. The authority that Nietzsche has is limited to criticism, and maybe at most the conviction of his criticism, but nothing positive emerges from that, right? Nietzsche's stuck in a critical space where he can, it's the twilight of the idols, and he can throw his hammers at them, but there's nothing that's left. He just turns everything to dust and rubble in his wake. But then Ricœur makes this point. He says, On the other hand, the, quote, only one path, or that only one path has been decisively closed off, that of an ontotheology, which culminates in the idea of a moral God conceived as the origin and foundation of an ethics of prohibition and condemnation. Right? Nietzsche does a great job of showing why that God doesn't exist. And what it means that God doesn't exist is that paternalistic God of accusation, prohibition, condemnation, judgment, that God doesn't exist either. But that's the only path that's closed off. And when you think about religion, that leaves a whole bunch of stuff open. Right? I mean, that's one path, that's one way of thinking God in the West, and that's one little path that's been closed off. Okay? And so what Ricœur says is that this is a positive development. Quote, "We are henceforth incapable of returning to an order of moral life which would take the form of a simple submission to commandments or to an alien or supreme will, even if this will were represented as divine." Right? So we're freed from that. We don't have to go back to that because they make some really good points. Right? And the fact that that one path is closed off, we might be nostalgic for that path. There's a lot of certainty in that path, right? It's like Lebowski's rug, right? It brings everything together in a nice harmonious sense. But it doesn't work. Not ultimately. Not if you really, really let yourself think about it and be open to that critique, right? So we might desire the certainty or the comfort or the nostalgia or the community that this path leads to, but the fact that it's closed off is not a bad thing. All right? So those are the three questions that Ricœur asks about atheism. Any questions about that?
So is it kind of like the God that has been killed is an authoritarian God?
It's the marriage of reason and revelation. So the reason comes out from the philosophical traditions that theologians have picked up, and revelation comes out of the scriptural. And both philosophical norms and revealed communities have a heavy emphasis on how to behave properly, right? And so whether it's Kant's critique of pure reason, which comes up with the categorical imperative that says this is what morality is, this is what our duty is, or whether it's the 10 Commandments, whether it's the Golden Rule, well, whatever it looks like, there's an emphasis on how we can be good people that's always involved. The theological traditions have tended to try to blend these together to create like a super absolute certainty, right? So you can believe in revelation, you can believe in philosophical reason, you can believe in the truth that both of those paths give you access to, but a lot of theologians doubled down and tried to merge both of those together super hardcore to make it super absolutely, positively, absolutely certain that this is how you should be. And so what he's saying is that we can just leave that behind now. It's okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Moving on. Ricœur then asks, can we recognize any religious meaning at all in atheism? And he makes two interesting points in here. First of all, he qualifies his earlier statement about faith. And he says, quote, "Only a prophetic preacher with the power and freedom of Nietzsche's Zarathustra would be able to make a radical return to the origin of Jewish and Christian faith, and at the same time make of this return an event which speaks to our own time. Such preaching would be both originary and post-religious." Right? So on the one hand, he holds open the fact that there might be a figure who can return to those roots and bring forth out from it something that's new, that's originary, that speaks to its time, speaks to its culture, and appropriates it in that really powerful way that like Thoreau would appropriate the Greeks, right? To really own and speak of it in a way that's fair both to the tradition and to the time that it's being spoken in. And in some ways, I mean, you can look at what Jesus does to Moses as being one example of that, right? Jesus does nothing but reiterate the law of Moses, but the way in which it's reiterated is far more appropriate to that time than the law of Moses, right? Nietzsche, in some ways, looks at himself as doing the same kind of thing that Jesus did Moses, but he's doing it to Jesus, right? It's that same reiteration that changes it drastically without actually undoing it. So for him, it's possible to do that. He's just not the person to do that because he's not a preacher. He's a philosopher. The second thing that he says that's pretty interesting that I wanted to just kind of foreground is this, and here again is another quote. Sin itself would appear as the opposite of a life ruled by grace. Sin, then, would mean life ruled by law, i.e., the mode of being of human existence which remains caught in the infernal circle of law, transgression, guilt, and rebellion. Right? And so, he's saying in once we get rid of this, right, this is gone. Well, what's that leave us? What it leaves us is a world of grace. And that grace is good. And we still have a concept of sin that we can look at, and sin becomes that really heinous loop of judgment and accusation and rebellion and forgiveness and sin, right? I mean, and guilt and shame. And it all just appears in this vile circle. That's sin. And that's turning our back on a potential for grace that would free us from those sorts of traps. Does that make sense? To me, that's a beautiful thought of what emerges after atheism. Go ahead.
So you go beyond good and evil, but it's not like it's a return to good and bad.
No.
Because if the good person in that Nietzschean sense of taking what you want would set up laws.
Or wouldn't even bother with laws, right? I mean, for Nietzsche, there's nobody less interesting than the brutes who are good. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it'd be like me just saying, I'm really big and tall and I have a big beard, and I want Andrew's computer, so I'll just take it. And what's Andrew going to do to me? Nothing. I get your computer. Right? There's no need for laws at that point. I can just take because I'm big. You know, but for Nietzsche, they're incredibly boring people. And the good for Nietzsche of the slave revolt and morality is that it made us interesting. Right? We become a lot more introspective and a lot more reflective. And there's no way that Nietzsche would ever advocate a return back to good and bad, because that would forsake everything interesting that developed in the wake of religion. You know, so instead, what his ideal is something that goes beyond that, and in a lot of ways, I think Ricœur's use of grace is his way of talking about the Übermensch, right, or somebody like that who is beyond good and evil, who's unfettered from that notion of law and guilt and rebellion and that orientation toward things. And it's just free and a joyful life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we come to the second part of today's lesson. And here's where it gets interesting, and here's where I'm going to erase the board.